This is Catholic Forum. I'm Bob Krebs. D.P. Curtin is an Irish-American antiquarian and translator. He grew up in Richboro, Pennsylvania, attended local parochial schools in Warminster and Southampton, Pennsylvania, and to date he has translated over 600 texts relating to the development of the Western world between the 5th and 15th century. He has a BA from Villanova University in Theological Studies, a master's from Chestnut Hill College, and a doctorate degree from Chatham University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He runs a large Catholic patristics organization, the Scriptorian Project, which handles church texts that have been otherwise untranslated from the Dark Ages and the medieval period. And we are very happy to welcome D.P. Curtin to Catholic Forum. You are the first antiquarian I had ever met, I think.
Yeah, it's an unusual term because there's not really anyone doing quite what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
And to use terms like philologist, that just kind of confuses people.
Well, antiquarian pretty much confused me. And patristics.
Patristics, yes.
Yeah. What is patristics?
So patristics is the study of the writings of the early church fathers. Patristic from patri, father in Latin, and also in Greek. There is a large body of work that makes up the greater tradition of Catholicism that's outside of the biblical text. And that's everything from the lives of saints to church councils to other things like philosophical writings, which kind of inform what the tradition has been over the centuries. Also things like historical works. How do we know things that have taken place in the past? We have great writers like Eusebius, famously of Caesarea, who writes about the early church between the close of the New Testament and the 4th century. So the patristics is a very large body of work, and it's one that's usually overlooked because it doesn't quite fit the mold for a lot of things. It's not biblical in the traditional sense, and it's not really involved heavily in systematic theology. So it just kind of falls into this realm of the world of historical Catholicism, and most people are unfamiliar with it.
Me included. So how did you get interested in this topic?
Well, there's a long and a short story to that. In short, when I was an undergraduate at Villanova, Villanova has this fantastic annex to their library at Falvey, which is filled with a lot of Latin texts that it looks like they were heavily used at a different time, but had just been kind of fallen to the wayside in recent years. And so as an undergraduate with a lot of time on my hands, I started to go through them and found that there were a lot of things in them that I would have loved to have known about, but were otherwise just kind of neglected. And some of it's more like the details of the faith than the banner headline. But to me, it felt like this was important, especially for those of us who want to go deeper, to try to really understand the tradition and where the tradition comes from. So
that's how you kind of fell in love with ancient writings. Yeah.
Well, some of it is the work with the Augustinians themselves. They very much pushed the Confessio of St. Augustine. And that was a very revelatory document. So especially as a teenager, you assume that the world doesn't really exist before you're born.
True.
There's just kind of this blank space. But the very real understanding that people in antiquity had the same struggles that we struggle with today. There's nothing really new under the sun in that sense. And so I think Confessions by Augustine was probably the first trigger point for that. As it's been for a lot of people, it's still one of the world's best sellers. And our new Augustinian Pope, I'm sure, would also like to promote that.
For sure, yeah. So how did the Scriptorium Project come about?
In truth, mostly by accident. I had translated a few works starting in 2005, and some of them were interesting, but people were interested in what I was doing. So I started, okay, they're just friends and other students who started borrowing some of my works, and it just kind of expanded from there. Eventually, I've been of the good fortune to collaborate with a lot of people over the years because my largest background is working in classical languages. So when we're dealing with the church outside of the classical realm, outside of Greek and Latin, it becomes a little bit more complicated. I think that the initial plan was just to stay within that realm, but like my interest grew. So in Catholicism, 99% of the church is what they call Roman, but there's also this 1% of Eastern Catholics out there. Mm-hmm. Everything from Ethiopians to Syro-Malabars in southern India to here in Philadelphia, we have an Armenian community, all of which was interesting to me. But where did it come from? What ultimately was its connection to the church? There's books about that, but going into the primary sources I felt like was really interesting. And I think my drive has been continually going at that. It's just the more I find out, the more is this vast, untouched library that hasn't been used in sometimes a few centuries.
As I mentioned in your introduction, you have translated over 600 of these documents, books, and so forth. Where do you find them?
So my initial point was with the Falvey Library. In more recent years, it's been a lot easier to obtain texts. Just because of the era of digitization, things are more readily available. So the movement that's been focused in at archives.com, where they scan documents from large national and sometimes old royal libraries. There was some Hungarian synods that I'd been translating. The intro was a dedication to the Empress Marie Theresa, who died in 1760. So not a book that I would ordinarily have access to.
Right.
But that's part of the issue, that these books exist. The language barrier is significant, and the scarcity of those texts, because they haven't been published in 400 years otherwise.
Yeah. Interesting. Very, very interesting. So how many languages do you know? Do you have to know how to speak them or just read them? Or, I mean, that kind of boggles my mind that you could figure out what, not only is it in a different language than your native language, but it's also old versions of those languages. Some instances very old.
Yes. So I guess sticking with the West, or I should say my own academic background, I had German, French, Latin, and Greek. Now, some of them were far more in-depth, and even saying things like Latin and Greek. We talk of Latin like it's a singular thing, but there's the classical Latin that you'd see in things like Cicero and some of the more famous Latin poets like Ovid. But there's also the vulgar Latin, the language that was spoken by most people. Mm-hmm. And as we drift away from the classical period in the Roman Empire, you tend to see a lot of documents that are more in the vulgar Latin, which is also a good stepping stone to things like French and Spanish and Italian, as Latin becomes less a distinctive language and more a regional dialect with certain German infusions. Ancient Greek is usually the more complicated one, because while there's a direct line between the Greek that's spoken by Homer and modern Greek, I guess it would be analogous to the difference between the way that we speak English and the English found in Beowulf. There is a distinctive medieval Greek in there that a lot of documents are, and sometimes I do definitely need help with that, just because the grammar shifts significantly. Mm-hmm. But that's the body of the documents that I tend to deal with. There are other languages that are outside of that I usually bring in additional help, or I'm taking more of an editorial role in things like Georgian, which is a language that I'm not familiar with remotely, or the church as it existed in medieval Russia, in particularly Kiev.
So if you have the basic handle on Latin and Greek, you can pretty much figure out some of those other languages that sprung from those core languages?
Sort of. Latin is a complicated one. So Latin and German are certainly very helpful because ultimately the medieval period is just that. It's the collision between the Latin world and the Germanic.
Right.
I think the jump from Old Spanish and Italian from Latin is very, very easy, as is Sardinian, which actually is very closely related to what they call African Romance or African Latin. So the language that's spoken by Augustine, which is now extinct in North Africa itself. But if you study the Latin, then you can understand the basis for most modern Romance languages that come out of that, which is at least why they used to push it with schools.
See, it's so mind-boggling to me because, like, I had to go to summer school for Spanish in high school. So, like, this is way over my head. Yeah, this is Catholic Forum. I'm Bob Krebs, and if you are just joining in, my guest today is D.P. Curtin, or do you prefer Dermot?
It's fine. I find Americans usually get confused by my first name, just because it's unusual on this side of the pond.
Mm-hmm. and Dermot is a antiquarian and a translator, and he is in charge of the Scriptorian project. And you're a local guy too, right? You live in Delaware or Pennsylvania, or
we're right over the PA Delaware border on the Delaware side.
Yeah. I didn't ask you about your wife is one of our religious education directors.
She is. She's over at St. Joseph on the Brandywine.
Yeah.
She's going to be leaving there soon to start teaching again theology on the high school level. But yeah, she's the local to Delaware itself. I'm the transplant here.
Yeah. So where did you grow up?
Bucks County in Richboro.
Okay, that's right. I mentioned that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're not too far from home. So let's talk about these 600 books that you have translated or assisted in translating. What are some of the more notable books in your collection?
Notable.
Do you have a favorite?
Oh, I have a few favorites.
Okay, well, let's go with that then.
Any of them are going to be winning like New York Times bestseller list anytime soon.
They're not going to be making movies out of them, or what?
My particular favorite is a language I do not understand at all. It's in a Dravidian dialect, which you figure you don't associate the church with southern India very frequently. But the tradition that exists in the early church fathers, which is repeated by Ambrose and Jerome and Eusebius, is that St. Thomas the Apostle hopped a spice boat to southern India, where he started the church there. And that tradition goes back very old, at least as early as the 2nd century. The Catholics that exist in southern India today, they don't have any books about their own antiquities. It just never developed, and if it did, it's since disappeared. But what they do is they rehearse a song called the Ramban Patu, which is all about the coming of St. Thomas the Apostle to India and the churches that he founded and how he was able to spread the gospel there. This is kind of like a sequel to Acts of the Apostles that's totally unknown to the West. Most people are familiar that Thomas went to India, but that's about it. Mm-hmm. And trying to be able to get at maybe even the historicity of that, it's very, very intriguing. So in the 16th century, when St. Francis Xavier went on his famous travels to the East, he had stopped in an island south of Arabia, Scoatria, I believe. And the natives there were Christians, and they said, yes, St. Thomas was here. And they were able to preserve the living memory of that for, at that point, 15 centuries, trying to be able to get at exactly what had happened there, trying to get at the historical personality of an apostle, stripping away all of those things. I think this text is very fascinating in that way, because here we almost have a direct line, a dialogue that isn't filtered through centuries. The issue is, of course, that it's a song, it's not a text, so we can't validate exactly how old it is. Mm-hmm. But I think that text, the Ramban Patu, is personally my favorite. I had to write an extended introduction for a Western audience for that.
What does that song tell us about the apostle?
The song says that he hopped a boat in the Red Sea, and that he went along what is, well, up until the 19th century, the Black Pepper route, the route between the Middle East and southern India, where all of the world's black pepper grew for centuries. He traveled with a merchant, and he founded 7 churches along the southern coast there in what is now Kerala. Before he was killed at Mount Chennai in southern India, there's other encounters like with the Brahmins, where he's able to demonstrate the power of God over the various Hindu deities. Mm-hmm. But this is it's almost like you're eavesdropping in an ancient conversation, a conversation that happened long ago that has otherwise been forgotten about.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. So how about another one?
Another one. So I've been trying to compile. My own background is very Irish. My first name usually gives that away. Some of the tragedy of the Irish church is that so many things have been lost. The wars of religion, the invasions that have taken place, the political upheaval. There was a lot of things happening in the old Celtic church and in the medieval Irish church that I really wanted to know about. How did it get to be kind of the powerhouse of Catholicism that it has been over the centuries, both in the Dark Ages when you have Irish monks going across the continent, founding monasteries, or even in our modern period in the 19th century where the Irish church produced so many priests and nuns and bishops that have continued to influence the church. I had to gain access. The Church of Ireland, which is actually an Anglican body, was able to give me access to some of their medieval documents going into probably like the 12th or 13th century. So there's a lot of churches of the medieval church in Ireland, ones at Cashel and at Dublin and at Armagh, that again have never been translated into English. No one seemed to have bothered to think that people would be interested in the subject. It was too esoteric. So trying to put those documents out, I think there's probably 15 or 20 of them at this point. But for those of us with Irish backgrounds, it kind of gives us an understanding of the foundation of what the Irish church was like, especially in its earliest points.
Very, very interesting. As you're going through these ancient documents that haven't been read for centuries, anything like shocked you or surprised you or really kind of made you say, wow, this is earth-shattering? Well, maybe not earth-shattering, but this is really something that I'd never even thought of before.
Earth-shattering. Earth-shattering would be great. I think...
How about surprised? Just surprised you?
I think it's probably the scope of things. So initially starting out, I assumed like, okay, there's books out there and I'll put them out. But the depth of it, I mean, even with several hundred books, like just barely scratching the surface here, the depth that Catholicism feels somewhat endless. Certainly the Latin is a big part of that. But you can find an endless depth if you're willing to look for it. There's almost a little bit of a labyrinth attached to it. And I think most people who do have the interest feel overwhelmed because there's so much information out there. Where do you even start?
Right, yeah. So you have job security for the next 200 years, right? So how has your work influenced your Catholic faith?
I think being somewhat of a pessimistic teenager, there was a very easy sense to be able to try to write off the church as being anti-intellectual or detached from the world. But you don't have to go far into my work to find out exactly how much of an influence the church has been into creating the edifice of Western civilization. Effectively, everything that we understand in our world comes as an artifact created by the church, from our medical system to our educational system, to even the fabric of time itself. We do it in the Anno Domini system, dating back to the time of Christ. There's a book out recently that had a similar theme to this, Dominion, by Tom Holland, that you begin to quickly recognize the dominion of Christ is untouchable. It's in everything all of the time. In a certain sense, it's unavoidable. I think that realization drew me in exactly how powerful this idea of the kingdom of God is upon you really is. But that's my understanding of it as somebody who's definitely done the homework attached to it.
Right. What do you want a reader or the average Catholic to take away from your work?
I think I would really like to, in the height of the Middle Ages, the church was the instrument of intellectualism. All of the great universities were founded by the church, especially in Western Europe. I think I would like to be able to help bring about kind of a rebirth of Catholic intellectualism. In the 20th century, there were great minds like Hans Urs von Balthasar and Karl Rahner who did tremendous work in that. But sometimes that can be inaccessible. In the case of someone like von Balthasar, he wrote a 700 or 800 page book in a 7-part series. That's inaccessible to most people. A lot of the work that I'm trying to put out is very digestible. It's very small, and it's very specific. A friend who was comparing it to Motown records, like we're pushing out the singles. Something that, like, okay, you can read these 20 pages and understand exactly what it was like to be in the church in France in the 12th century, or in Ireland, or in Spain. Something that gives a little bit of historic context for communities. In the United States, we don't have quite that kind of depth to it, because we can only go back usually a little more than 200 years. But for a lot of people whose faith is definitely connected to their sense of ethnicity or nationality, that becomes a big thing. Mm-hmm. So what does it truly mean to be Irish Catholic? Mm-hmm. Someone who grew up as that, there's superficial things attached to it, but I'd really like to be able to inspire people to understand what that means in depth.
Hmm. Very good point. How can our listeners and viewers get more information about your work?
So there is a website, thescriptoriumproject.com, where things are cataloged both by the Eastern and Western Church, and then individually from that. So things like St. Augustine's work is in the Punic Church, Punic being the other language that he spoke other than Latin, Frankish, Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxon, you name it, we probably have it at this point. And the catalog continues to expand month to month.
Well, Dr. D.P. Dermot Curtin, the Indiana Jones of old texts, it was a pleasure meeting you, and may God continue to bless you and your work.
Well, thank you.